guys, Tony Vanderwilt here. We've been going through Money Matters. Got a quick hitter today, Money Matters number 6. Last week we were talking about generosity. Today we're talking about debt, namely what debt does to us and how God desires for us to really, I believe, stay out of debt, and what are the parameters, principles in relation to that. Well-known verse that you probably know in Proverbs 22, verses 7, it says, "The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower becomes the lender's slave." Borrower is slave to the lender. A lot of people, when they hear that, they say, well, that doesn't apply to me because I have a job and I can pay my bills. This is not really an issue of whether or not you can pay your bills. Borrowing, the first point I would say is borrowing has to do with more than whether or not you can pay your bills. When you say this doesn't apply, they're not lord over me because I can pay my bills, you're missing the point. The point is that this gives another person an issue of power and influence over top of you that God does not desire for them to have over you. You see, with wealth there is power, and with power there is influence. The Bible doesn't see wealth as being bad and doesn't see the influence and power that wealth gives as being bad in and of itself. But in the wrong context, it's a bad thing. And we can't say that doesn't have influence, because actually if we look at the verse just preceding this one, you'll notice that it says, "Train up a child in the way that he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it." Why would you put that verse right in front of that? Well, because there's influence, there's power here. Train up a child in the way that he should go. When he is old, he will not depart from it. Borrower is slave to the lender. So there's the idea of just pass these things on to your children because they're incredibly important as it relates to not only your life, but the future generations of yourself and your family. And so, the first thing we just need to see and understand is borrowing has to do with more than whether or not you can pay your bills. If you look later on in Proverbs chapter 22, you see in verse 26, it says, "Do not be among those who give pledges, among those who become guarantors for debts. If you have nothing with which to pay, why should he take your bed from underneath you?" Don't cosign is the idea. Well, it's not just don't cosign. Why would you not cosign? If a person has to cosign, there is not enough equity in the purchase to cover the cost. And so if he goes into default, now all of a sudden there's not enough there to cover the debt. And so you should never borrow without already having the collateral to repay in that which you borrow, or in money that's been stored up. If you've had money stored up, why would you borrow to begin with? There may be some justifiable reasons, but oftentimes that just is not the case. So, a job is not collateral. So just by saying, I've got a job, and I understand that within our financial system it says, well, if you have a good paying job, that's collateral in terms of you'll be able to repay your note. But the Bible doesn't speak in those terms. A job is not for certain. If anything we've learned over this last year, that is true. And so whatever job you have, you can't feel secure in your job. Our security is supposed to rest in God. And when we have to go out, or we do to go out and borrow, there should be collateral there to be able to repay already in that purchase. And so that already knocks out just a whole number of types of lending. New vehicle purchases, when you drive it off the lot, there's not enough equity there to repay it. Student loans, you're banking on the fact that one day you'll get that job. Well, there's not enough collateral there to repay it. And so you should never borrow without having the collateral to repay. And here's why. It's because really borrowing is not a math problem, it's a behavior problem. We're not going to go there, but I would encourage you to go to Psalms 37. Just circle the first 7-9 verses of all of the commands that God is giving, and David actually is speaking here in what he is saying, because you'll see things like, do not be envy, do not be angry, do not fear, do not fret, be anxious for nothing, trust in God, delight in God. It's because it's not a behavior problem, right? And so just understand that is going on. And then also in Psalms 37, if you look at verse 21, it says, "The wicked borrows and does not pay back, but the righteous is gracious and gives. For those blessed by God will inherit the land, but those cursed by God will be cut off. You see, if you borrow, you have to pay it back. Borrowing is characterized as a curse by God, not a blessing from God. And so there are just very, very few instances where, one, you've got a purchase that you make where there's enough collateral there in order to make that purchase, and then two, that it's actually a blessing and not a curse. Probably, just in my own estimation, just probably the only thing that you find there is probably a home and real estate within that home, where your equity generally continues to grow and you put enough down to cover the difference. And so you have that maybe there. But you just don't see borrowing being looked at in a positive light in Scripture. And I think part of the reason for that is borrowing keeps you from being able to be generous and give. In verse 26 of Psalms 37, it says, "All day long he, being a righteous man, is gracious and lends, and his descendants are a blessing." So now all of a sudden I'm able to be generous, and not only am I be able to be generous for those in need, that generosity leaves a legacy within my own family to be able to be passed on so that God is glorified long after I'm gone. We're going to talk more about that over the upcoming weeks. Generosity and leaving a legacy. So very important things that we will cover later on. But what does debt do? And I would say four things. First, it produces the wrong kind of discipline. When I borrow, there is a forced labor now that's placed upon me versus a self-discipline if I do not borrow. So it produces the wrong kind of discipline. Secondly, it removes delayed gratification and it undermines contentment. Saying no today until God says yes, right? So it's a self-discipline, contentment, delayed gratification. Then when I receive it, it is a joyous, glorious thing in relation to that. Well, borrowing removes this delayed gratification and it undermines contentment. Third, borrowing diminishes an eternal economy. See, trusting through hardships of today's life for the eternal rewards of tomorrow. That is an eternal economy that God's put in place. When I borrow, I undermine that. So there is a life that I can live through hardships for the gratification of what's going to come tomorrow, and we would say even for all of eternity in relation to that. And then fourthly, which we just got through saying, is borrowing and debt stifles, it smothers out generosity. We're not talking about tithe here. We're talking about generosity. When you owe people and you are burdened by living paycheck to paycheck, you cannot be generous. And so it stifles that. So I just pray that, go to the sermon on this, Money Matters 6, go through it, take time, pray about it, but put into action to get out from under debt. You will find a life worth living, and that's what we desire for you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next week.